Last fall, there was a concern among many around the country and many Republican voters that if elected, Democrats in the House, the Senate, and the White House, if they had the whole of government, would try to implement massive change, transformative change as it was described. And there was a consistent view articulated by Democrats and other places around the country, oh, that'll never happen because Joe Biden, after all, is a moderate. And these ideas are crazy ideas. Nobody would ever do some of the things that are being talked about. Well, Mr. President, I have to say that pretty much everything that was predicted is now coming true, at least as it pertains to legislation that is being advanced by Democrats here in the Congress and by the White House. Starting, of course, with the massive amount of spending, the massive expansion of the government. We saw that with the coronavirus relief bill, which ended up being about $2 trillion, that on top of the $4 trillion that Congress, in a bipartisan way, last year had put toward coronavirus relief. Much of that $2 trillion, in fact, most of it, about 90% of it, didn't have anything to do with the coronavirus. Only about 10% of all that spending of nearly $2 trillion was actually related to the coronavirus. Most of it was other things that Democrats had wanted to fund that's been on their wish list, if you will, for some time, and an expansion of government. Well, if that weren't enough, there's now talk of a, quote, infrastructure bill, which would spend on the order of another $2.5 to $3 trillion. Again, much of which is unrelated to infrastructure. And if you define infrastructure simply as roads and bridges, things that most people think of infrastructure, the number that's been used is 6% of that entire bill is about infrastructure. Now, if you add in broadband and a few other things, it gets slightly higher than that, but the point is most of the spending in this bill is unrelated to infrastructure. It's another $2.5 to $3 trillion expansion of government, new spending, financed, some with tax increases, but a lot of it just adding to the debt, just putting it on the credit card and handing the bill to our children and grandchildren, something that's been routinely done around here for a long time. And so, Mr. President, what I think people should find concerning is that the worst fears predicted about what the left might do if in charge of this country are, in fact, coming true. And much of this new spending, and by the way, the infrastructure bill is a first installment. There's another bill to follow. We're told that would include more trillions in spending dealing with other issues, including health care. So you've got this massive expansion of government, massive amount of new spending, unprecedented, truly unprecedented in history, coupled with massive tax hikes, also unprecedented. What's being talked about just in the first infrastructure bill is over $1 trillion in new taxes. So the taxing, spending, borrowing patterns that we predicted would happen are in fact coming true. So add to that, Mr. President, other things that were suggested and proposed throughout the fall, the course of the campaigns and subsequent to that, included adding D.C. as a state. So adding D.C. as a state it's going to pass the House of Representatives. I'm not sure they're voting on it today, but it's either been voted on or will be voted on. It will pass the House of Representatives. That's a very, very serious proposal, which dramatically changes the United States Senate and I believe what the founders intended with respect to the District of Columbia. And then you add to that legislation that has already passed the House, is being contemplated being passed here in the Senate, that would federalize elections in this country, that would codify ballot harvesting, that would ban voter ID, photo ID, something that I think most Americans think is a very wise thing to do when it comes to election integrity, to make sure that people who are voting actually are who they say they are. Voter ID is a pretty important part of that. It would have the taxpayers finance, publicly fund campaigns in this country. I can't imagine the American taxpayers, among all the other things that they have to finance in the government, also want to finance the campaigns that they have to sit through. It would politicize the Federal Election Commission, which in the past has been a balanced 3 Republican, 3 Democrat bipartisan committee that oversees and regulates elections in this country. So it would politicize it and give the Democrats an advantage, a partisan advantage on the Federal Election Commission. So all those things are in the this elections bill, which would transform, I mean, I'm talking literally transform the way we do elections in this country, which historically, and by way of the Constitution and the law, have been handled, administrated at the state level. States have been very involved. What this would do is consolidate more power in Washington, D.C., pull those elections, the regulation of elections, up to the federal government, coupled with all the changes that I just mentioned, which there's no way, absolutely no way, that even if passed, this could be done and be implemented in this upcoming 2022 election, which secretaries of state from across the country, including Democrat secretaries of state, have indicated. So that's another thing that's on that liberal wish list, Mr. President, that I mentioned, federalizing our elections, taking them away from the states where historically elections have been handled and administered, and bringing them here and essentially nationalizing our elections. Then there's the Green New Deal. The Green New Deal is, I believe, being introduced again today by a number of Democrat senators and House members, something again that would completely change the way that we fuel our country in ways that would drive up dramatically the cost that an average consumer in this country, average family, what they would have to pay for energy, done through mandates, regulations, heavy-handed government requirements, as opposed to incentivizing some of these things that I think we all agree we should be doing when it comes to cleaning up our environment. But, Mr. President, the Green New Deal is opposite of that. The Green New Deal is a government, Washington, D.C., mandate, requirement, heavy-handed regulatory approach to that issue, and something that has struck fear in the hearts of literally tens of millions of Americans since it began being talked about only a few years ago. So those are just a handful on the list of what I would call horribles that the left has been advocating for some time in this country. All of these things could be accomplished if the Democrats were able to follow through with another thing that they said they would never do and are now talking about, and if they had the votes would do, and that is to do away with the legislative filibuster, which is a feature of our democracy that goes back literally 200 years to our nation's founding, and something that has ensured through those years that the minority has a voice in our policymaking process, that there is an opportunity for both sides to collaborate, to compromise, and to ensure that there isn't majoritarian rule. The founders were very firm about that idea. They thought there needed to be checks and balances against that. And the legislative filibuster has provided that for 200 years. And it's something that, even though Republicans were asked repeatedly during the last 4 years of the Trump presidency by the president himself to get rid of the legislative filibuster, we refuse to do that because we believe it is essential as a feature of our democracy and something that protects the minority in this country, the minority rights, the voice of the minority in our policymaking process, and ensures that we get solutions that ultimately are durable over time because they have been negotiated in a way that requires the input from both sides of the political equation. Well, Mr. President, that is something that has been sacred, so sacred that even despite the fact that President Trump on 34 different occasions, asked Republicans, or probably more, I would say ask would be a gentle word, but essentially said Republicans in the Senate need to get rid of the legislative filibuster. Either did that by tweet or by public statement. Clearly something that he believed was a priority in order to implement his agenda. We resisted that. We resisted that even though we would have benefited from it on numerous occasions when it came to moving legislation through the Senate. So for the past 6 years, we've had the majority. For the past 4 years, we've had the presidency up until January of this year. And notwithstanding the constant barrage of suggestions, again, putting it mildly, to get rid of the legislative filibuster by a president from our own party, we resisted that simply because we believe the legislative filibuster is such an essential and critical part of our democracy. So here we go. The Democrats get elected. They have on countless occasions told me privately, individual senators on their side of the aisle, that no way, we would never do that. We'll never get rid of the legislative filibuster. You know, it's too important. We're not going to do that. In fact, 33 Democrats signed a letter as recently as 3 years ago, basically, essentially saying, ratifying their support for the legislative filibuster, and the suggestion that it could possibly be done away with, suggesting that that would be a terrible, wrong thing to do for this country, and essentially coming out strongly supporting the legislative filibuster. 33 Democrat senators here in the United States Senate coming out in support of the legislative filibuster. Now, shoes on the other foot, they're in the majority for about 2 months, and they are already talking openly, and many of whom have come out and endorsed that idea. And frankly, to be honest with you, Mr. President, I think it would have been done already had it not been for a couple of Democrats who I think are thoughtful enough, contemplative enough, and you know, revering enough of our institutions in this country not to be run over by the majority on their side and do away with something that is just so critical and so important to our nation's not only heritage and history, but to our future. And if it weren't for that, I think it would have been already. I think the senator from New York, the Democrat leader, in a New York minute, would get rid of the legislative filibuster if he had the votes to do it, partly out of fear that he will be savaged by his woke left if he doesn't do it. And obviously the President Biden, who, as I mentioned earlier, many people thought would govern as a moderate and a unifier, and someone who fiercely defended the legislative filibuster as a United States Senator, made speeches on this very floor defending fiercely the legislative filibuster, is now also talking about getting rid of it in order to implement massive tax hikes, massive spending increases, massive growth in government, expansion of government, unlike anything we've seen in history, including the 1930s, the New Deal. This would dwarf that by comparison. D.C. statehood, federalize our elections, pass the Green New Deal. All of that, Mr. President, all of that could be done at 51 votes if they could blow up and get rid of the legislative filibuster. And all of those are very real, not hypotheticals, real. These are things that have either already passed or are going to pass the House of Representatives, are being considered here on the floor of the United States Senate, including today, I think, the Green New Deal is being reintroduced. These are legislative proposals that are so far out of the political mainstream in the things that they're contemplating, it's hard to believe. But just as an example of the impact that these tax increases could have, you look at what the tax cuts that were passed, the Reform Act that was passed in 2017, was doing in terms of the economy and the benefits that it was having across all sectors, demographic sectors in this country. And up until the pandemic, we had the best economy probably in 50 years, lowest unemployment rate for sure, biggest gains in income, wage levels, among particularly minority groups. In fact, this is census data from 2019 showing that real median household income hit its highest level ever for African American, Hispanic, and Asian American workers and retirees. 2019 poverty rate was the lowest in more than 50 years for children at 14.4%, and the lowest ever for individuals, 10.5%, for families, 8.5%, and for households headed by unmarried women, 22.2%. More impressive is that even after 10 years of economic expansion, the 2019 gains shattered all records as real household income leapt by $4,379 in 2019 alone, 13 times the average annual gain since data were first collected. So the tax policies that we have in place, Mr. President, are working. And there have been record income gains, especially among lower income Americans. The poverty rate, as I mentioned, plummeted 11% in 2019, the most in 53 years. Things were moving in the right direction. And so the question is if it isn't broke, why fix it? And why would you go and increase taxes in a massive way at a time when the economy is growing and expanding and creating better paying jobs. And what I would argue, Mr. President, is that the best solution for anybody in any income group, across any ethnic group, for improving their standard of living, their quality of life, is a growing, expanding economy that's throwing off better paying jobs and higher wages. That's what raises the income level. That's what lifts the boats, Mr. President, for every American. And that's what we ought to be looking for. Not how much government can we pull back to Washington, D.C., how much can government do for you, but how can we put the right policies in place that put the conditions in place for economic growth that will stimulate the kind of investment that will create those good-paying jobs and start lifting wages across this country. It's about growth in our economy, Mr. President, I would argue. It's about good-paying jobs. It's about higher wages. That's what our arguments here ought to be about. And instead, right now, we're talking about growing government and increasing taxes and reversing what I would argue is a lot of the progress that I just mentioned, that from 2019 U.S. Census Bureau data. So, Mr. President, why would we go back on the great progress that has been made, and why would we start to contemplate some of these suggestions that I mentioned, from the tax hikes, the spending increases, the federalizing of our elections, the Green New Deal, repealing the filibuster, which again would consolidate more control, more power in the hands of a few people here rather than keeping it distributed, and it would consolidate more and more power in Washington, D.C. And that kind of brings me to the topic for today, which is on that list of horribles and things that would undermine the integrity of our political institutions in a way that these other things would as well, but I would say on a much higher, much expanded level. And that is packing the Supreme Court, which again, people thought was a hypothetical. That was one of those things. Now those guys down there, those Democrats, they're not that crazy. There's some moderate Democrats out there. There's some people who would stand up in the way of that and keep something that crazy from happening. Well, it didn't take very long. It only took a week, Mr. President, just 1 week after President Biden established his commission to study court packing and other ostensible Supreme Court reforms. Democrat members of Congress in both houses have introduced legislation that would actually pack the court. This is no longer a hypothetical. This is colleagues on this side of the aisle, Democrats in the House of Representatives, that are openly advocating packing the Supreme Court in the form of legislation. And not just adding a couple of members, adding enough members to give them a majority. To give them a majority on the United States Supreme Court. Now, many people are probably wondering what the crisis was that precipitated this legislation. A crisis so grave that these Democrats couldn't even wait for the results of the President's stacked commission. President Biden's commission, which is stacked with Democrats to give them the result that they want, is supposed to report back in somewhere, a time frame, I believe, about 6 months. They couldn't even wait for that. They had to introduce a bill that would pack the court. So why do they have to do that? Well, I'll tell you. The crisis that requires us to immediately add 4 additional justices to the Supreme Court after 150 years of the court at its current size is that a duly elected Republican president was able to get 3 Supreme Court nominees approved. Apparently, by confirming a duly elected president's Supreme Court nominees, Republicans stole the court's majority, which I guess apparently rightfully belongs to Democrats, and in doing so, quote, politicized the Supreme Court and threatened the rights of millions of Americans, end quote. And that's from the Democrat statement about why they have to pack the courts now. This legislation, the bill's Senate sponsor says, and I quote, will restore the court's balance and public standing and begin to repair the damage done to our judiciary and democracy, end quote. That from the Democrats' sponsors, his statements with respect to this legislation. Necessary to restore the court's balance and public standing and repair the damage done to our judiciary and democracy. Well, Mr. President, there's only one problem, of course, and that is that this supposed crisis of confidence in the Supreme Court doesn't actually exist. A majority of Americans approve of the job the Supreme Court is doing. The Supreme Court's approval rating actually increased over the course of the Trump administration. If the junior senator from Massachusetts, who's one of the sponsors of this legislation, is looking to address a crisis of confidence, perhaps he should take a look at Congress, whose approval rating is consistently far lower than that of the Supreme Court. The real crisis, Mr. President, the real crisis we're facing is not a crisis of confidence in the court. It's that Democrats are apparently willing to do long-term damage to our democracy for partisan gain. Yes, Democrats are being hypocritical. And yes, their court-packing proposal is outrageously and transparently partisan. But more than that, it's dangerous. Because Democrats' court packing would eliminate public confidence in the nonpartisan character of the court. Right now, the Supreme Court is generally seen as being at least somewhat above the partisan fray, as the founders intended, a fact that I think is reflected in the court's positive approval rating. And while some justices are regarded as more conservative and some as more liberal, Democrats don't see justices as partisan in the way that we see politicians as partisan, and rightly so. I can think of more than one significant case where supposedly conservative justices have sided with the court's liberals, and there are plenty of cases where all of the Supreme Court's justices have ruled unanimously. As Justice Breyer pointed out in his recent speech condemning court packing, Supreme Court justices do not fit neatly into conservative or liberal categories. But that perception of Supreme Court justices as above partisanship would not last long if Democrats succeeded in packing the court. Just think about it. We've had the same number of Supreme Court justices, nine justices, for more than 150 years. 150 years, Mr. President. Then Democrats sweep in, announce the makeup of the Supreme Court isn't to their liking, and propose adding 4 justices, all of them appointed in one fell swoop by a Democrat president. And that's in addition to any nominations the president might make in the ordinary course of things. Does any Democrat sincerely think that after that, any Republican would regard the Supreme Court as nonpartisan? Or for that matter, how many Democrats would regard the Supreme Court as nonpartisan? And Mr. President, just imagine if the roles were reversed. Imagine that Republicans were proposing to expand the Supreme Court and add 4 Republican-nominated justices. Imagine the howls of outrage that would ensue, and rightly so. Democrats, the media, the far left, all would rightfully decry the politicization of the Supreme Court. And yet Democrats expect us to believe that if it's Democrats who do this, if it's Democrats who pack the Supreme Court, somehow this move is not a partisan and self-serving one. As Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg said, if anything, and I quote, if anything would make the court look partisan, it would be that. One side saying, when we're in power, we're going to enlarge the number of judges so we would have more people who would vote the way we want them to, end quote, from the late Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Or in the words of Justice Breyer, and I quote, I hope and expect that the court will retain its authority, an authority that was hard-won, but that authority, like the rule of law, depends on trust, a trust that the court is guided by legal principle and not politics, end quote. That from Justice Breyer. And Justice Breyer noted, and I also quote, structural alteration motivated by the perception of political influence can only feed that latter perception, further eroding that trust, end quote. Mr. President, as these 2 reliably liberal justices make clear, Democrats' court-packing plan would do the very thing Democrats claim to oppose, and that's to politicize the court. The Supreme Court would quickly lose its nonpartisan standing and quickly become a joke. Democrats cannot possibly think that court packing would begin and end with their move under the Biden administration. I can guarantee that the next time there's a Republican president and a Republican Congress, Republicans would be moving to balance the Democrats' power grab by adding a few seats of their own. Then the next Democrat administration would do the same thing. It wouldn't be long before the Supreme Court had expanded to ludicrous proportions. 20 justices? 30 justices? Maybe more? Instead of a respected and separate branch of government, the Supreme Court would be co-opted by the legislative and executive branches. The separation of powers upon which our entire federal government is built would be destroyed. Mr. President, the consequences of politicizing and trivializing the court, as packing the court would do, would be grave. If Americans don't respect the court, they will have little reason to respect the court's decisions or regard them as either definitive or binding. There's been a lot of concern, rightfully so, about the increasingly partisan and contentious nature of our politics. Politicizing the court by packing the court would further inflame partisan division and lead to increasingly bitter and dangerous friction in our society. Mr. President, it is deeply, deeply disappointing that Democrat leaders and others in their caucus who wish to be seen as serious and responsible policymakers haven't condemned this dangerous proposal to upend a bedrock institution of our democracy. I understand that it may be difficult for them to stand up to the unhinged and far-left fringes of their party. And it's possible that some of them are reluctant to condemn this proposal because of the partisan advantage it would provide. But anyone who cares about the health of our democracy and the stability of our country should be loudly and clearly opposing any discussion of court packing. I hope that at least some of my Democrat colleagues will find the courage to speak up and consign the idea of court packing to the ash heap of history where it should have remained. Mr. President, I yield the floor.